We're at a college, we can be collegiate.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight today for the Grassroots activism event. My name is Chad Lonsky. I am the president of Trojans For Liberty at USC. We are the main libertarian student organization on campus. If you'd like to learn more about Trojans For Liberty, we have our sign-up sheet in the back. We like to bring multiple speakers every semester. We have mixers, all sorts of other events in the libertarian realm that you're free to learn more about if you sign up on our sign-up roster. But I'll hand this over to Tiana Lowe, who will be moderating the event between Pat Harris and Austin Peterson. So thank you for coming out.
Okay. Hello, thank you. Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to today's event, Grassroots Insurgency from the left and right. I'm Tiana Lowe. I'm a senior majoring in mathematics and economics, and I'm also a board member of Trojans For Liberty at USC. So I would like to start off by saying thank you so much to USC Annenberg and the Center on Communication Leadership and Policy for making this space available to us, my fellow board members at Trojans For Liberty, our core organizer and liaison with the Harris campaign, Avery Hogarth, Catherine Mai for all the artwork for the event, the Leadership Institute for their financial support, and all of you in the audience for being here for an event that is not strictly partisan. So, the last year has featured a uniquely awful display of political intolerance, ranging from emphatic disdain and personal vilification of political opponents, all the way to outright violence and attempted murder of sitting members of the United States Congress. In times as emotionally charged and culturally divided as these, it is easy to take solace in solitude with only those who think like us and confirm our beliefs. It is not uncommon to hear liberals like Charles Blow denounce any and all conversation or even association with Trump supporters, or to hear said supporters deem anything that they view as negative fake news. However, these tactics are not only dehumanizing and antithetical to the spirit of democracy, they are also terrible strategy. We are undergoing a monumental realignment of our political parties. Civil war at the DNC has forced Democrats to choose between establishment neoliberalism and identity politics-driven European-style democratic socialism. The right must choose whether the soul of the GOP belongs to protectionism and nationalism or limited government libertarianism. Rather than debating over semantics and political tactics, we must be willing to face these national feuds for what they are, a battle of ideas. Until then, we as a society are willing participants in intellectual dishonesty that will continue to divide this House until it can no longer stand. Today, we're privileged to be joined by two men who are particularly able to discuss the insurgency of ideas from the left and the right. Both also happen to be candidates running for the United States Senate. To the left, we have Pat Harris, a criminal defense attorney and a civil rights activist, and a progressive Democrat challenging California incumbent Senator Dianne Feinstein from the left. Mr. Harris represented Susan McDougal in the Whitewater investigation associated with Bill and Hillary Clinton, and later co-authored her New York Times bestselling book about the ordeal. While polling has found that Kevin De Leon, the president pro tempore of the state Senate, is the primary challenger to Senator Feinstein's seat, he has recently been mired in controversy over the state Senate's mismanagement of routine sexual harassment and misconduct. With the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party emboldened, Mr. Harris has the opportunity to challenge the California establishment from the left, but he will need to prove the viability of his vision first. To the right, we have Austin Peterson of Missouri, a small business owner and small government activist and commentator who rose to national prominence while running for the Libertarian Party bid for the presidency in 2016. He came in second to Governor Gary Johnson, but after a series of missteps, to say the least, by Governor Johnson, Mr. Peterson has emerged as a leading voice of libertarian conservatism and hopes to unseat Senator Claire McCaskill, a Democrat who's seen is one of the most statistically vulnerable in the 2018 midterm elections. Mr. Peterson faces not only a divided state, but also a party split between protectionist Trumpism and more classical conservatism. Mr. Peterson must navigate both divides if he wishes to win an emerging purple state. Today's debate will feature 4 broad topics pertaining to fundamental disagreements between the left and the right, with a penultimate section focused on Mr. Harris and Mr. Peterson's relationship with the insurgency in particular. We'll have 15 minutes at the end open to questions from the audience. Each candidate will have 60 seconds to answer each general question and 60 seconds for a rebuttal. Questions focused on specific candidates will also have a 60-second response time and a 60-second rebuttal. Our first topic is healthcare. And I would like to begin with a relatively simple question, but one that I think will get us going. Is healthcare a right, and why? Let's start with Mr. Harris.
Healthcare is a right. There are a number of things that I think in human existence that we have to acknowledge as rights. We have to acknowledge that healthcare is one of those. We are in a situation in this country where healthcare is in a crisis stage. We have almost 30,000 people a year who are dying because they do not have health care or health insurance. That's more than that 30,000 is more than this campus, the number of undergraduate students on this campus today. We have, as a democracy, we collect taxes. We collect taxes because it is a social contract with the people that we are going to provide services for those people that actually make a difference in their lives. There is nothing more important than health in people's lives. You've heard it 100 times from your relatives, from your friends. Health is the most important thing in people's lives. We have to help provide for that. I'm sure we'll get to talk about later how to do it, but I absolutely 110% believe that healthcare is a right.
Okay. Here's something you're not going to hear from a typical politician. I don't own you. You don't belong to me. I don't control you or your life. But if healthcare is a right, then I do have a say in how you behave. As a matter of fact, as soon as healthcare was declared a right by the Supreme Court and Obamacare was upheld, liberals were standing outside the Supreme Court smoking cigarettes unironically. Because as soon as you engage in something that is detrimental to your health, I have a right to fat shame you. I have a right to get involved in your personal behavior. How much do you want stupid politicians involved in regulating your healthcare? In Britain, healthcare is a right, but if you're overweight, you do not have a right to use the hospital because you've engaged in dangerous activity. How would you like to be denied your right to health care because you smoke, because you do drugs, because you're overweight? In America, you're free to blow up to 200 or 300 pounds and eat and be like Ron Swanson and enjoy your steak dinner. You're not free to force everyone else to pay for the consequences of that. We need good health care in this country. In the United States, if you want eye surgery, it's not covered by insurance. But what's happened to the cost and the quality of health care for eye surgery in the last 15 years? The quality has come up and the cost has come down because there's no third party involved in the transaction. I want better health care, but I cannot give you things that I can't first steal from my neighbor, Pat Harris. If I really wanted to get elected, I could just tell you I'd give you all the free goodies that you want.
It's time for Mr. Harris's response.
But I can't give you that. I cannot promise you utopia. I can give you freedom, though.
Okay, you have 60 seconds to respond.
Sure. What he just described is socialized medicine, which is not what's being asked for. We don't ask for a British system. When he says we are sitting there saying, if you're healthy or smoking, we can prevent you from having health care, that's not what Medicare for All is. That is an absolute fallacy. To say that is to distort what Medicare for All is. Medicare for All is exactly the opposite. It's for all. Everyone, including those overweight, those who are smoking, everyone is entitled to it. And the key here is, you say you don't want politicians running it. Well, right now you've got insurance companies running it, and the only thing insurance companies care about is profits. What we want to do is give it back to the doctors and the patients. They're the ones that ought to be able to have a say over what health care is, not the insurance companies. And every single person in this country will be covered. That's what Medicare for All is. And to say it isn't, that is an absolute fallacy.
Well, that's interesting because I have a copy of my bill from a corporation that the government automatically enrolled in, took my personal information and says, you have been automatically enrolled. No choice was involved here. Where is the Medicare for All? This is government corporatism. And if you're supporting Obamacare, you're supporting big government. You're supporting the corporations. This is a violation of your rights to have your personal information taken and given away to corporations without your consent. We are supposed to be living under a government where we have consent of the governed. I never gave consent for my personal information to be given to the corporations, and this is a total violation of our individual rights.
We don't have Medicare for All. That's the problem.
Okay, so as a follow-up for you, Mr. Harris, California State Senate, the bluest in the nation, voted against passing a single-payer health care bill on the grounds it would cost twice the amount of our state's existing budget. Given the ability to write and pass a bill for Medicare for All, how would you fund the vast expense estimated for the Sanders presidential campaign at nearly $1.4 trillion?
I think there's three ways to fund it. First of all, what you have to do is you have to understand that the administrative costs alone in the insurance industry, that in itself would fund about half. If we eliminate the administrative costs that insurance companies charge, that in itself would fund about half of it. The second way you would fund it is you have to be able to cut back on corporate welfare, which is what is killing this country, and the fact that corporations do not pay their fair share. If corporations are willing to pay their fair share, if we make them pay their fair share, that can fund another huge part of it. The third part of it you use is you have individual raises for small individual raises for taxes, small corporate raises, and you still have enough money that an individual family making $50,000 a year, even if their taxes are raised to pay for health care, will save $4,500 a year. Corporations, groups that pay, they will actually save money. That's how you're going to pay for it, and it can be done. It's done in every other country in the industrialized world. We can do it as well.
Mr. Peterson, 60 seconds.
Well, obviously, the state of California realized that there are some economic certainties. They couldn't afford to pay for the health care. I mean, the laws of supply and demand are more powerful than any government edict. There is a limitless, infinite amount of demand for goods and services, but there's a very limited supply. The question is, do you own the fruits of the labors of a doctor? If there is one doctor on the island and he's a heart doctor, does he get a day off? If he wants to take a day off, instead of performing heart surgery, are you going to send the men with guns to go get him to make sure that he performs his mandated surgery? You're demanding that other people's labor, the fruits of their labor and their time, is owned not by themselves. You're saying that liberty is the opposite of what we believe in. If we want more goods and services to be delivered, we have to allow the market to set pricing. You should read the critics of socialism, the Nobel Prize winners like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who argued that without prices, there's no way to determine what the value of a good or service is in the community. And doctors across the country have stopped accepting Medicare, they've stopped accepting insurance, and they're now doing direct billing. And we're seeing the costs come down. When transparency is in the system, when there is a relationship directly between the doctor and patient, rather than to wait for the government. If you want socialized medicine, take a look at the VA.
Okay, we have to move to a follow-up. Okay, so Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
One of the advantages posited by government-sponsored healthcare, proponents allege, is the ability of a single insurer to bargain for cheaper services through a monopsony and bargain for better deals for patients. In the Netherlands, a monthly prescription for Nexium costs $23. In our own great nation, $215. Why do you believe that a more centralized healthcare system would be less economically efficient?
Well, of course, one of the problems we face in this country is that our patents, right? We have a patent and a trademark and a copyright system that's very egregious because it's actually Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul advocated for legislation together. The libertarians and the progressives of the Senate came together and said that Americans should have the freedom to purchase drugs from Canada. If we are the land of the free, why are we not allowed to go and purchase these drugs from Canada? It's because the corporations have captured our government. I believe in a separation of corporation and state. But regulatory capture is a thing, ladies and gentlemen, and you should learn what it is because the corporations have captured our government. So the solution is not more government. The solution is to give the government less power so the corporations will not lobby to go and take our rights away. The big corporations love regulations, they love patents because they can be like Martin Shkreli and they can increase the price of drugs and no one can compete against them. If you want true competition, you need free markets. Big corporations hate capitalism. They hate free markets. They do not want free markets in healthcare because it means that smaller providers can come in and eat their lunch. We need free markets.
Mr. Harris, your response?
And a free market economic system.
Sure. We keep confusing socialized medicine with Medicare for all. Socialized medicine is not Medicare for all. Socialized medicine provides that the government actually pays the doctors a salary, owns the hospitals. We are not talking about a system where doctors are paid by the government. Doctors still maintain their own practices. They get to decide when and where they're going to practice and do what they want to do. I do agree with Mr. Peterson on the fact that corporations are trying to cut back on our ability to get drugs from overseas and from other countries. I disagree with the fact when he says corporations love or dislike capitalism, dislike or love regulations. They dislike capitalism only when it affects them directly. They love capitalism when they can take away regulations, when it's unregulated, when they're able to do whatever they want to do, whenever they're able to lobby and pay off, and I think this is where we can agree, when they're able to pay off politicians to get what they want, they love that capitalism.
Okay, well, Mr. Harris, much like the positive externalities of our military spending for our allies, proponents of private healthcare systems argue that without profit incentives, the United States would cease to persist as a leader in research and development of medical technology and pharmaceuticals, and as a result, the world would suffer. How would your proposed system of healthcare continue to induce supply of medical intelligence?
Well, again, I actually represented a case where I fought Pfizer in court. And what you learn is Pfizer and the other large corporations, drug corporations, come out and say, we need money for research and development. You know, that's where we spend all our money. That's where we're out there taking all of our profits and we're putting them right back into the company. Except when you look at the numbers, that's absolutely not true. They're not putting it back into research and development. A very small share. In fact, Pfizer, when we looked at it, about 8% of what was actually being produced was going back in for research and development. So I absolutely believe that when you find a situation like Pfizer and like drug sales, for example, Sweden looks at Pfizer and says, you're going to pay, here's what we're willing to pay for this drug, this Pfizer drug. We're willing to pay $326 for this drug. You take it or leave it, period. And Pfizer, of course, takes it because there still is a profit there. We don't do that in this country. We allow them to bid and bid up against insurance companies until that same $326 pill costs us $2,000 here.
And Mr. Peterson, your response?
No, I don't believe in any form of welfare, but if I were sitting in the Senate right now with my esteemed colleague and we were having a debate over this question, I would offer a compromise to say I would cut every single penny of corporate welfare before I ever touched a dime of individual welfare, and we can make that agreement, I think, right now, because the problem with corporations is that when you subsidize them, they do not have an incentive to innovate. But it's the same with anything else. You don't want to subsidize corporations the same way you don't want to subsidize higher education through student loans. Because what happens? The prices come up. The inflation occurs because when you have a guaranteed money supply pumping into something, there's no desire to innovate. We see this with net neutrality, we see this with video games. When you have a guaranteed money supply from the government, then the people have no incentive. The school administrators have no incentive. The hospitals have no incentive to innovate. So we need to cut off corporate welfare. That way they should spend their own money in research and development. And like I said, the corporations, they don't like capitalism because if they had to fight and sink or swim on their own, then the smaller competitors could come in and eat their lunch. But they are overburdened by regulations and the fact that they are at a disadvantage because the small corporations don't get the welfare, they don't get the bailouts, and corporate welfare entirely.
So, for 6 long years, Republicans built careers on the promise of repealing and replacing Obamacare. The previous system was not perfect, but the current system runs risk of implosion due to compromised risk pools saturated with the elderly and the ill, and physicians exiting the workforce due to decreased reimbursement rates. Not all Americans would receive coverage without the Obamacare stipulation that insurers cannot deny patients coverage due to pre-existing conditions, yet insurers' profits are threatened without an individual mandate, an aspect of Obamacare's constitutionality which remains hotly contested. How would you reconcile this paradox of pricing from both an economic and a legal perspective?
There's a problem because we sometimes mistake health insurance for health care. Health insurance is not health care. You can have all the health insurance in the world, but that's not going to guarantee you care. And because we have gone from an insurance scheme that was set up to help people with major crises to now just having it for every time you need to go in and you need to get something checked, the prices are inflated. Think of it like this. If you go into a supermarket and you have supermarket insurance, are you going to buy hamburger or are you going to buy steak? If somebody else is paying the bill, you're going to buy steak every time, which is why when you go to the doctor, they're incentivized to get as many tests as you can, and this inflates the costs. The problem, of course, is the incentive. Economics is always about incentives. Until you understand how we are disincentivizing or creating perverse incentives in our healthcare marketplace by subsidizing insurance, we're not subsidizing health care, we're subsidizing health insurance, then the prices are not going to come down. We have got to get back to a doctor-patient relationship. You should be able to order a doctor on your phone the same way that you order an Uber on an app. But as long as we have regulations which will stop us from engaging in these direct transactions with our doctors because the insurance companies get in the way and soon socialized medicine will get in the way, then we are going to have inflated costs and no one is going to be able to get care and you'll have to wait a year just like you do in some places.
Mr. Harris,
like
your
Canada.
response?
Well, we can solve that problem. Medicare for All does exactly that. And keeping referencing to socialized medicine is a red herring. Medicare for All is not socialized medicine. And I keep repeating that. Socialized medicine is a system where the doctors are employed by the government, where the hospitals are actually owned by the government. Medicare for All exactly allows you to have an Uber app for your doctor. You get to choose who you want as a doctor under Medicare for All. I do agree with my colleague, and I think if both of us on the Senate floor, we could hug and sing Kumbaya when it comes to getting rid of corporate welfare, because we agree on that 110%.
I'm glad that we found a point of unity. As we move on to our next topic, I'd like to address the silver lining of hosting a debate between two insurgent political figures, untethered to antiquated notions of party lines. For instance, both Mr. Harris and Mr. Peterson are strong proponents of criminal justice reform, and both view the LGBTQ debate through the lens of individual choice rather than social imposition. However, you differ on how you wish to fund the government that you would desire and to what extent. So, Mr. Peterson, as Senate Republicans scramble to pass their tax bill through the reconciliation process, it has reignited the debate within the right that the GOP might have lost sight of balancing the budget in favor of slashing taxes while maintaining spending. Could you briefly explain, in broad terms, obviously, how you would resolve these factors and what you would prioritize given legislative authority?
Well, first of all, you brought up criminal justice reform and social issues. So, I mean, I want to live in a world where gay married couples can defend their marijuana fields with fully automatic machine guns. That's a little bit too much freedom for some people, and it's a little bit scary. But freedom is scary, but frankly, I prefer it to the alternative. But the problem, of course, is that we're talking about tax cuts right now, and we haven't gotten to government spending. Government spending really is the problem. If you want to solve the problem of government of taxation, you're going to have to solve the spending problem first. And we're always spending $3 or $4 or $500 billion more than we take in. I believe we take in somewhere between $3 to $3.5 trillion a year. Are you telling me that we can't run the entire federal government on $3 trillion a year? We can't even talk about spending cuts to increases in growth, let alone actual cuts to overall growth. That's why I advocate for what we call the penny plan, which would cut 1 penny out of every single federal dollar. Instead of trying to kill Elmo or Big Bird entirely, just give Elmo a little haircut, 1% across the board spending cuts, along with a balanced budget amendment so that our government cannot spend more than it takes in. We need a government that is within limited constitutional framework. We need to limit the ambition and the power of politicians
Mr. Harris, your
to take from
response?
us and to give to others. The redistribution of wealth is the problem with this society.
How about instead of cutting Elmo, we cut the Defense Department? How about instead of cutting Elmo and PBS and the arts, why don't we instead talk about cutting a Defense Department that actually, with the Senate, not even Donald Trump, but with the Senate, actually passed a defense authorization bill for $50 billion more than Donald Trump asked for? How about cutting a Defense Department that has ordered helicopters they can't even use? How about cutting a Defense Department that spent $16 billion to figure out a way to eliminate $1 billion worth of ammunition? How about we talk about cutting that first, and then let's go talking about cutting culture and PBS. As Winston Churchill famously said in World War II, when his Defense Department came to him and said, we can cut back on to help the war effort, we can cut back on culture, we can cut back on medicine. He said, well, exactly what are we fighting for then? That's what we ought to be thinking
Well,
about.
The penny plan would cut from the DOD as well, just FYI. Everybody
well-
takes a haircut.
Okay, Mr. Harris. Since the Enlightenment, global poverty has fallen from over 90% to below 10%. Countries with heavy centralization, such as the glorious nations of the Soviet Union, Cuba, Venezuela with 600% annual monthly hyperinflation, Zimbabwe and North Korea, have faced poverty and mass starvation. How would tax policies necessary to fund these many programs you're describing not face these pitfalls, aside from just defense spending cuts?
Well, I don't think you can, first of all, I don't think you can say besides defense spending cuts when you've got a Defense Department that their own audit states that they, in essence, wasted $125 billion in the last couple of years on administrative costs. So you can't just throw that out the door, number one. Number two, which we've talked about and agree with, we have a corporate welfare system that essentially allows corporations to pay minimal, if in some cases nothing, to do business in this country and to actually take business out of this country, and yet we allow that. We also allow in this country, we allow the top 1% to pay a tax rate that is well below what has been paid in the past, including even under Ronald Reagan, who agreed that the top 1% ought to be paying more than what they're paying now. There are a number of different ways we can pay for the for the social programs we need. We just have to have the will to do it, and we have to have the desire to understand we have to help our people, and we don't need to be funding the Defense Department and corporations.
If taxation of 100% of your income is slavery, at what percentage is it not? the Amazon is trying to get a deal somewhere. Most of the cities in the United States are bidding on Amazon, trying to come and bring their warehouse there. Chicago recently offered Amazon what they call an income tax refund. Essentially what they would do is in Chicago, if Amazon comes and builds there, then Chicago will take all of the income taxes that are paid by Amazon employees, and it will refund them to Amazon. Think about that. You're working for Amazon, you're paying income taxes, you think they're going to go to these social programs for the good of all, and it's actually going to your employer. At what point is taxation theft? Ask me this. If you think that government is going to allocate your resources wisely better than you are right now, you have Venezuela, you have North Korea, you have places where they don't believe in individualism, where they believe in collectivism, where your rights are sacrificed to the collective good. And what is the collective good? Can anyone define that? What's good for me versus what's good for you? The idea of individualism and individual liberty is to allow choice in the marketplace of sexual ideas, in the marketplace of social ideas, and in your checkbook as well. I'm fiscally conservative. Socially, it's none of the government's damn business. That's liberty.
To stay on the topic of taxation, proponents of the free market often argue that without taxation, social safety nets mandated by the government would be replaced by those of voluntary charity. Historically, this effect has proven true. However, economic data shows that while Americans are far more charitable than citizens of other nations, Americans are becoming less charitable, an effect that some have hypothesized is a result of Americans moving multiple times in their lifetimes. If ardent capitalists are to advocate for Americans following where the jobs are, Mr. Peterson, how are they to reconcile globalization's negative effects on local charity? In other words, will a mandatory social safety net soon become necessary?
Well, the problem, of course, is that my root philosophy is that since I don't own you and I don't own the fruits of your labor, how you choose to distribute them, whether they are for good or for ill, is none of my business. And I don't have the constitutional authority to take your money. But when it comes to a social safety net, the United States is the most charitable nation in the world because we're the most prosperous nation in the world. And that's a good incentive for us to have policies that will allow us to prosper. One of the things that people talk about when they look at for growth is the GDP. They say the GDP is a good example of growth, but the problem with the GDP is that it is a socialist measure of wealth because it includes government spending in the overall total pool. And let me explain to you briefly why this is a fallacy. If you have a pool of water and you take a bucket and you put it in one end and then you walk to the other end and you pour the water back into the pool, have you increased the overall total volume of the pool? No, but that's what happens when we have government spending. Government spending is not inherently productive. So I don't know what the social safety net should be because I'm not smart enough to know. He's not smart enough to know. Everyone in Washington, D.C. is not smart enough to know. We should be free to choose where we spend our money.
Well, again, we're throwing out red herrings because we have a situation where you're saying, I don't own you, the government doesn't own you. That's an extreme. No one thinks the government should own anybody or that there should be slavery. That's an extreme. Versus, so you can go from one end to the other. Okay, we have absolute, say, communism where everybody shares versus they don't own you personally. That's an absolute red herring. Nobody's asking to own anybody. What we're asking is to say, look, I am my brother's keeper. I need to help others to survive as well as myself because not only does it help them, it helps me. Because when we have, for example, a strong educational system, it not only helps my neighbor's kids, it helps mine. It helps raise them as well. We, as a group, as a country, have made a determination and have to make a determination. Are we, in fact, our brother's keeper, or are we a collection of individuals who are going to live our lives separate from each other?
Can I ask him a question? May I ask him just a question? Yeah. What is your rightful percentage of what someone else has worked for?
Well, that's a red herring because there is no percentage you can label to. But to say total 100% slavery is, again, you're throwing out something that is not anything anybody's asking for. No one wants 100% slavery. No one's saying the government should control every aspect
So what is the
of
rightful
life.
percentage of what someone else has worked for? How much do you own of what someone else has earned? What is the right percentage of how much you deserve?
When you say what somebody has earned,
yeah.
We have a tax system. We have a tax system that if it's fair, it makes those determinations. Like every country in this world, we have a social contract. If you're going to be part of this country, you have to pay taxes. So you
don't believe in 100%. What percentage is too much? Just give me a number. Just tell me how much is too much. 50% too much?
Well, again,
51?
okay.
52?
You gonna let me answer the question?
Yeah.
You're gonna talk over me.
I'm just curious.
All right. Let me answer the question by saying this. Again, we have this typical Republican argument. How much is it? How much is this much? It's different for every person. We've got 380 million people in this country. You can't sit here and tell me to say, okay, Pat, is it 100% for everybody? Of course not. It's different for every person in this country. If you are a multi-billionaire in this country and you have used the resources of this country to make the money, you should be willing to give a higher percentage and give back because that's the right thing to do and it's the American way to do
So
it.
he believes in diversity, just not equality.
Okay, well,
That doesn't even make sense.
Mr. Harris, I have a follow-up for you. So according to Rob Haskins and Isabel Sawhill at the Brookings Institute, the prominent liberal think tank, 75% of people who do the following will be members of the middle class into adulthood. 1, graduate from high school. 2, maintain a job. 3, don't have a child prior to age 21 and ideally with a stable partner. How can the state replace personal responsibility, or much less the role of parenting? How can depleting personal savings through heavy taxation encourage or even allow the persistence of the middle class?
Again, the question's wrong. The question is not to tax the middle class. The question is the opposite. The question is reduce taxes from the middle class so that they can increase their savings. The idea is not to hurt the middle class. It's not to tax the middle class further. It's to lower the taxes in the middle class, which is the exact opposite of what the current tax bill is doing. The point is to tax those who are in the 1%. The 1% themselves are being way undertaxed. We know that for a fact because we know, as I said, even Ronald Reagan advocated for a higher tax rate than we have now for the 1%. It is a fallacy to say, well, you'll hurt savings with taxation for the middle class because we are trying to actually lower taxes for the middle class, for the lower incomes, and increase it on the higher because that's the way it should have been. That's the way it was when we created the greatest middle class in the history of the world in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. That's the way it was done.
It seems there were like 2 or 3 questions in there. Can you just restate briefly?
So can the state replace personal responsibility? And does heavy taxation discourage personal responsibility?
I think that it does. I mean, if we are our brother's keeper, then we want to create the right incentives because, again, economics is about incentives. We want to be incentivized to help one another. Certainly, if I'm more prosperous, then I am more incentivized to give that away. Bill and Melinda Gates are going to give away most of their fortune. I think Warren Buffett's going to do the same. Why is it that they didn't need a law to do that? It's because I think and I believe that people are inherently good. Not everyone is good, and that's why we do need a limited government to prosecute those who would violate others' individual rights. But we want to create incentives so that people are willing to invest, not just invest in things like healthcare or buildings or corporations. We want people to invest in one another because we know that if we invest in our children, then they get a better education, and then maybe they could take care of us in our old age. But because we now have government incentives like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, we are no longer incentivized as children to care for our elders. And that's why we have such disconnect in our society, because we have replaced our government as a member of our family. We need to get back to what we had when we had those one-room schoolhouses. We had the best education system in the world. I'm not saying go back to no technology. I'm saying that when people were incentivized to care for their children and to care for their parents, we had a much stronger
Final
society.
thoughts? Okay. All right, for our next topic, do you hate America if you kneel for the NFL? I'm totally kidding. No, we're not doing that. Okay. No. Instead, we'll be discussing money in politics and campaign finance. So, Mr. Harris, to say that you've been vocal in denouncing money in politics and dark money specifically would be an understatement. In the summer, you wrote that it was, quote, at the root of our political problems on Twitter. However, dark money comprises just 3 to 4% of federal election donations. How is this amount an existential threat to our political system?
It's not just dark money. It's corporate money. It's corporate money. It's even, I have talked about in terms of PACs, even PAC money. It's not just dark money. When you talk about 3-4% being dark money, that's fine. But when you talk about corporate donations, you're talking about, or corporate PACs, you're talking about 70 to 80% of most candidates' money. We live in a society now that the representatives, however you want to phrase it, I phrase it, they've been bought and paid for. I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, I don't care where you stand politically, our politicians have been bought and paid for. When a politician basically stands up and says, I support A, B, and C, and D, it's largely because you can guess that their donations have come from groups that support those positions. We have to get back to a system where people are what count, where it's people's opinions are what count. I'll very quickly quote a Princeton study that actually showed that the only factor in a congressman's vote, the only factor wasn't public opinion, it was whether or not the corporations had donated to him. That was the only factor that made a determination, not whether people wanted it.
Okay, Mr. Peterson.
Ask Jeb Bush how much dark money helps. Ask Hillary Clinton, who's the president now. She outspent him 5-1. Money doesn't actually buy votes. It can influence elections. But the things that actually influence elections are door-to-door campaigns, going around to events, and when you put things like caps on the amount of money that people like you and myself can raise for these campaigns, it puts us at a distinct disadvantage to those people who have all the dark money. The fact that we can only accept $2,700 from an individual will probably ensure at least one of us are going to lose. There's a doctor in Louisiana who's a very wealthy businessman, and he is an advocate against the war on drugs. I am the only Republican running next year in my state for federal office who advocates for a complete and total abolition of the war on drugs. He'd like to give me more than $2,700. Am I bought and paid for by the rich oligarchs who want to end the war on drugs? I should be able to give what I want freely to support the political causes that I believe in. If I believe in Pat Harris, I should be able to give Pat Harris $10,000.
But
it's not going to change.
Get that on record? Can we?
Right. If I believed.
Mr. Peterson.
Yes.
A less contested aspect of the Citizens United ruling was the application to labor unions as well as corporations. While far less profitable, unions do donate sizable amounts to federal elections. Union dues and thus donations can come from taxpayer money in public industries. By 2015, the Obama administration had given the AFL-CIO and SEIU a combined $53 million. In the 2010 midterm election, the AFL-CIO spent $608 million on predominantly Democratic donations, and the SEIU $150 million. In short, a Republican taxpayer can have her money used against her personal interests if a union donation goes to a Democrat, or vice versa, of course. Do you believe that unions should have the same free speech protections as corporations per the Citizens United ruling?
I do. Of course, the problem is that people really do believe that whoever has the most money is going to win the election. And we're seeing time and time again that that is not the case. Dave Bratt in Virginia ran against the very powerful Eric Cantor and defeated him in his primary, 20-1, outspent 20-1. The problem is not with the funding mechanisms, ladies and gentlemen. It is with the incentives that we have created in our system of government. Yes, the labor unions should be allowed to spend freely, not with taxpayer dollars. Of course, that's the problem. I should not have to pay for taxpayers. Taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for labor unions, just like I shouldn't have to pay for abortions, just like you shouldn't have to pay for invading Afghanistan or Iraq if you don't agree with those things that the Department of Defense does, which certainly many of those interventions I don't agree with. That's why I advocate for a limited government, so that your rights are not being intruded on. If you support Israel, if you support Palestine, either way, it doesn't matter, because you would not be funding them through foreign aid, because a limited government would not have the ability to do so. So yes, you should have free speech. Yes, you should be able to spend what you like on political campaigns. No money is not as powerful as you think. People say, I'd like to get money out of politics. Well, I'd like to get politics out of money, but I'm assuming the Federal Reserve and monetary policy is probably not going to come up, because it's damn boring.
When you say
All right.
it's easy,
And the Fed.
when you say that it's easy to say, okay, everybody should be able to give what they want.
Yeah.
That's great, because everybody here can probably afford to give $10, $15, $50, $100. Maybe you can afford to give $1,000. The problem you got is you've got the Koch brothers. You've got Tom Steyer on the left. You've got Sheldon Adelson, who basically, by one person essentially kept a presidential race alive by giving over $1 billion to Newt Gingrich, which ended up hurting the Republican Party dramatically, by the way, in the general election. You can't match that. And when you're sitting here saying, oh, you gave examples of people who won with less money. Yeah, that's always the sort of example that you use. Let's find one or two. But let's go to the 98% of the elections where the person with the most money won. And that person in general had a benefactor or several benefactors that gave them millions, and even in, like I said, the case of Sheldon Adelson, $1 billion. That is unfair. For one person to have that kind of effect on the democracy in this country is dead wrong.
Yeah, I mean, my grandparents would love to give me $10,000, right? But they can't. The corruption, grandma trying to buy
Mr.
me out.
Harris.
Well, I'll tell you this then. What you ought to do is you ought to be fighting against the ability for corporations to give money, for PACs to give money, and increase individual donations. we can agree on that. But that's not what you're fighting for. You're fighting for allowing corporations to continue to pay millions and millions of dollars, and for PACs to pay billions of dollars. You agree to fight against that, I'll agree to fight for grandma.
Okay, Mr. Harris. In Bates v. Little Rock, the ruling settling the constitutionality of a civil rights organization's right to withhold the names of their donors to the federal government, Justice Potter Stewart wrote, "It is now beyond dispute that freedom of association for the purpose of advancing ideas and airing grievances is protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The organization in dispute, the NAACP, at the time was challenging racially motivated individual state government demands to see their list of financial supporters. Mr. Harris, do you agree or disagree with this ruling? And how does a donation to a political candidate's campaign differ from donating to a media outlet which advances said ideas and airs said grievances?"
If I understand your question, I'm not sure I do, but if I understand your question, it's, do I agree that the fact that donor lists should be made public? Is that, donor list of candidates should be made public?
Do you
Is that-
believe that they should be protected? And how do you,
Protected to keep them from being made public?
Yes.
Oh, I got you.
and then how is donating directly to a campaign any different than just airing a grievance through the media?
I think, to answer the first part of your question, I think, in essence, we ought to have absolute, open, there shouldn't be any kind of secrets as to who's donating to a campaign, period. If you're donating to a campaign, we ought to know about it. It doesn't matter if you're donating $200, $2,000, if you're a corporate PAC donating $200,000, we ought to be able to know it. And when that PAC, the list of the people who donated that PAC, we ought to be able to know that too. There is no reason we shouldn't have full transparency. Interestingly enough, our current president argued for that very thing, full transparency. We ought to have full transparency for every donation that's made. There's no reason not to. How is it we should be able to pick our candidates if we don't know who's backing them, if we don't know who's giving them money, if we don't know what causes they're giving? That's why it's important to have full transparency.
See, I tend to agree. I think we do need full transparency. But if we have full transparency, can't we donate as much as we like? I mean, isn't that the entire point, that you should be able to then hold that person accountable? If Sheldon Adelson is donating $1 billion to Newt Gingrich, then the citizens who give Sheldon Adelson their money voluntarily, he doesn't work for the government, he runs casinos, his money comes freely from the free market, then people can choose to boycott Sheldon Adelson. They can choose not to purchase any of his goods and services. And we, as a community, can rally around together to activate or use activism against that person if we think that they are going against citizen self-interest. There's quite a few things. Sheldon Adelson is not going to fund my campaign, that's for sure, I'll tell you. But yes, I do believe in full transparency, but I also believe you should be able to donate as much as you like. I mean, it's a problem, and it's, again, it is directly stopping insurgencies like your own and mine in my race from being able to compete, because the incumbents write the laws. They are the ones who will ensure that they get reelected, and I guarantee you they will pass a law to stop people like Pat Harris from becoming the next senator of California. God forbid. So that's the problem.
Okay, so on that note, both men here today have been chosen specifically for their independence from the deeply entrenched tradition of our two political parties and their contradictory desire to impugn their intellectual cores. However, the road to disruption is never easy. Populism is less an ideology than a strategy, as both successful yet philosophically opposing President Trump and emerging Democratic leader Senator Bernie Sanders illustrate. For our final section of our formal debate, we'll focus on the role of the grassroots insurgency, the political establishment, and both senatorial candidates individually. And I would like to open with a question for both of you, and it's an easy one, hopefully. What were the flaws of your respective presidential candidates in the 2016 election, and why do you think that they ultimately won the party's nomination?
Oh, that's easy for me.
Go ahead.
I think the part of the problem for, well, the huge problem for the Democrats in nominating Hillary Clinton was hypocrisy. I think that what you saw was the nomination of a candidate who was bought and paid for by Wall Street, and you can't sit there as a Democrat and claim you're a man of the people, and that you're the people's party, and that you're out there fighting for minimum wage workers, and you're out there fighting for farmers, and then go to Wall Street and take $600,000 in speaking fees. I think that is the height of hypocrisy, and I think that's exactly why she lost, or a huge part of it. I think that the Democratic Party has lost its soul and has drifted, unfortunately, in the last 20 years to a centrist position where there is no difference between the Democrats and Republicans on a number of issues at this point. And I think the Democrats who supported Bernie Sanders, I think the Democrats who are now beginning to take control of the party again, recognize that We want to get back to being the party of the working man, and our candidate wasn't. It's that simple.
Well, Pat taxed all of my best talking points on that. But there are two reasons why Donald Trump won. One was obviously Hillary Clinton, and two was what you identified, is that the Democrats no longer speak for the working man. They didn't speak for the blue collar. Hillary didn't campaign in important states like Michigan that she lost to Donald Trump. And of course, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you have to understand that many of these people, they live in a bubble. They don't care what happens out in flyover country. I've frequently sat in Fox News green rooms and listened to our heads of state discussing about how they spend as little time as possible outside of the Beltway or outside of the New York, D.C. Acela corridor. So the sort of the attitude, the elitist attitude on behalf of our governors and the rest of the country, I think is a big reason why Donald Trump won. Because whether or not he was an elite, and he absolutely was, a billionaire businessman who was frequently on television and who also was a Democrat for a short time, he ran in these circles. But what he did say to the people in the Midwest and in flyover country was that I will destroy your enemies. And populism, which was reaching a fever pitch, was the perfect tool for him to use. And like you say, populism is not an ideology. It's whatever is most popular is correct. Things like the wall, building the wall. It's less, and it used to be that we would take the money from Mexico, right? But that changes once we get into power. And so I think that unfortunately what's happened is that the Republican Party has become a populist party, and it's actually becoming a progressive populist party, more in the vein of Theodore Roosevelt back in the days. These are the people who believe in expansive federal government, in excessive executive power.
Mr. Peterson, on that note.
Can I just say one thing on that, because
Sure.
it's actually something we agree on. I think he's exactly right. In the state of California, my opponent is Senator Dianne Feinstein. Senator Feinstein has given basically 2 speeches in the last year. Both of them, one of them was in LA and one of them was in San Francisco. She refuses to go out anywhere in the state. She refuses to actually go talk to real people. The first thing she did, she announced on a Monday she was running for re-election. Tuesday night, she was at a billionaire's home in Beverly Hills sipping champagne in a swimming pool. I was actually at a dive bar in Sonora. I won't tell you why I was at a dive bar in Sonora, but that's a different story. But I was actually talking to people. I talked to a guy who came up to me and said, I hate you damn environmentalists because you cost me my job in the logging industry. And another guy come up to me and say, I drive 145 miles a day because I can't afford to live in San Francisco. Those are the people we need to be talking to, and you're exactly right. Our politicians don't want to talk to them. You go out to Central California, they'll tell you they haven't seen a politician in forever. I love to go out there because I get great receptions because they're just grateful anyone's willing to come talk to them.
The challenge in the Republican Party now is that there are some healthy strains and libertarian impulses within populism, and those should be encouraged. But unfortunately, there are some very authoritarian strains as well that must be resisted. But in some sense, because Trump destroyed the Republican establishment, in some ways, we have replaced one form of authoritarianism with another, and we must guard against the imposters of pretend patriotism like we see with the NFL rallies. I think that this is nothing but the trappings of patriotism, and real patriots aren't the type of people who just stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. True heroes don't take a knee. Real patriots get off their knees, grab a flintlock, and march on the redcoats.
Okay. So, Mr. Peterson, in the month before the election of President Trump, you tweeted, quote, surprisingly, Hillary Clinton's private speeches reveal her to be less of a socialist than Donald Trump. 1 year later, just last month, you tweeted, quote, I was the only Libertarian Party presidential candidate who said nice things about Trump last year to explain why he was a strong candidate. Many scoffed. Bad, end quote.
Bad, both true.
Is this reversal of opinion, which one could call flip-flopping, a recognition of a turning tide, a reconciliation of divisions, or one of expedience?
All right, so let's go back to the Hillary Clinton tweet. So Hillary Clinton, in her speeches for Goldman Sachs, revealed that she was quite the capitalist, because what did she say? She revealed that socialism didn't work. She had to pretend to the Wall Street bankers that the system, she had to pretend to the people of the Democratic Party that the system was rigged, because that is how you get people to vote for you. You get Bernie Sanders. I'll give you free stuff because the corporations run everything and the system is rigged. But what Hillary revealed in her Goldman Sachs speech was that she knew that in a dynamic free market economy, economy that in just 1, 2, perhaps 3 generations, any capitalist could be out on their ass from competition. And Donald Trump never revealed that publicly because he was pushing for things like tariffs, trade restrictions, and walls, which was antithetical to the historical, traditional conservative Republican Party, the party of Ronald Reagan, which advocated for free markets, free trade, and for free immigration. That is not the Republican Party of today. That has changed. My opinions on those things have not changed. But what Donald Trump has done recently is to push for things that I agree with, which are things like repealing Obamacare, cutting spending, cutting taxes, regulations. When Trump is right, I say so. When he's wrong, I've opposed him. So it's not a change of opinion. And also, if you're not free to change your opinion based on new evidence, then you're not really free at all. It's called having an open mind. It's not a flip-flop.
Mr. Harris?
Well, 2 things. First of all, cutting taxes and regulations is what he says. It's not what they do. When they say they're going to cut taxes and regulations, what they're saying is they're going to cut taxes for the 1%, and they're going to cut regulations on Wall Street. You, I know, are a small business owner. You, of all people, ought to respect the fact that when generally a Republican gets into office and talks about cutting regulations, they don't cut regulations on small business, which is where it should be cut.
Right.
And you and I can agree on one thing. Small business regulations are onerous, and they should be cut. But that's not what Donald Trump's cutting. That's not what any Republican cuts. Not what any Democrat cuts. When they get in office, they talk about cutting regulations, and they cut Wall Street regulations and not small business. Again, the things that actually affect Americans. Secondly, you talk about free stuff. It's not free stuff. We pay taxes. No one's asking for free stuff. We pay taxes for it. We want to get what we're paying for. We want infrastructure. We want internet. We want things that we're paying taxes for. It's not free stuff. And I will tell you, the thing that always bugs me the most is when people talk about, free stuff like Social Security and Medicare. These aren't free. We paid all our lives Medicare. You pay Social Security taxes. You pay Medicare taxes. They're not free. They're the money you've put in and you deserve.
Mr.
It's
Harris.
not free
Government
stuff.
is a necessary evil, but it is an evil, so all I can say is thank God we don't get all the government we pay for.
Mr. Harris. Yes. While you're running on a tidal wave countering established incumbent candidates of decades past, you too have ties to the Clinton family, having represented Susan McDougal throughout the Whitewater controversy. Do you think that progressives, and specifically this modern movement, can embrace figures with ties to the establishment?
No. Quite frankly, no. And first of all, let me be clear on something. Susan McDougal was a partner of the Clintons, but when I represented Susan McDougal, it had zero to do with the Clintons. It had to do with her situation and what her personal situation was, which actually was at odds in many cases with the Clintons. And I can tell you right now, we had zero contact and zero conversations with the Clintons. So that's number one. Number two, I think we have to, as the Democratic Party, we have to take ourselves away from the establishment Democrats. That is what has hurt this party. This party was grown up on the working man. If you walked around any street in this country in the 1970s, 1980s, and you ask anybody, what's the party of the working man? Every single one of them, everyone would have said the Democratic Party. You walk around the streets now, go out in this campus, go anywhere and say, who's the party of the working man? They're going to look at you and go, neither one of them. Neither party is. We have to get back to being what we were originally, what we have to be for the future, but we have to have a plan. We can't just say we're going to be there for the working man. We have to have a plan, including...
Mr. Peterson?
I'm sorry.
Well, this was about his personal connections to Watergate, which I'm unfamiliar with. I will say, yes, I am a Republican. I did go on
Whitewater, not Watergate.
Whitewater, excuse me. Watergate.
Not Watergate.
I did go on a date with a Russian once, but otherwise I have no ties.
We can discuss that
Yeah,
later.
we can discuss that later. But let me just talk about why I'm doing this. I'm campaigning because I actually do believe and trust in you and have faith in you, the American people, to be able to make the kinds of decisions that are important for you to be able to invest in yourself, in your education, your families, your friends, your churches and neighbors. Because one of the things Ben Shapiro and I have been batting back and forth recently is the question is that conservatives need to accept the libertarian position on government, and libertarians need to accept the conservative view on society. Meaning that if we are to reduce government, then we are going to need social institutions to replace the social safety net. And before we had social safety
Final
nets,
thoughts.
we did. We had cattlemen's associations, we had insurance shares, we have things like that cropping up right now, but we need to be able to be free to discover the most effective way to serve one another. That
So
rhymed.
I actually have a follow-up to my original question with Mr. Harris. Intersectionality, or the prioritization of elevating the voices and perhaps the privileges of those who fulfill specific diversity requirements, has become the ethos du jour of the Democratic Party. For example, intersectional feminist, if you want to use that word, Linda Sarsour says that it is impossible to be both a Zionist and a feminist on the grounds that supporting Jewish statehood is inherently Islamophobia. Progressives have embraced Sarsour and the like. Is this the right path for Democrats to take, strategically and on principle?
I think part of the problem, the results from your question is this is one of the famous things that both parties tend to do. That is taking somebody, a quote from somebody, and saying that that's somehow the position of the party. That's not the position of the Democratic Party. It never has, never will be. No one thinks that Zionism and feminism can't exist together.
Was the Women's March not embraced by progressives?
The Women's March was certainly embraced by progressives. That has nothing to do with Zionism, though. The Women's March wasn't about Zionism. To take a quote from somebody who is a fringe figure or who says something and then say that's the position of the Women's March or the position of the Democratic Party, it's not. We are in an era now with sexual harassment being the major issue that focuses most of our attention on pretty much a daily basis. It is not in any way, shape, or form incorrect to listen to what the feminists and listen to what women are saying about the issue. We need to be addressing it. We need to be talking about it. It needs to be out in the open. The best single thing that has happened in the last probably 30 years for women has been the fact that we can now openly talk about what is going on in the workplace, whether it be at Jack in the Box or in Hollywood. We can now talk about the issues because it's been silent for too long.
Mr. Peterson?
So what you lack in intellectual diversity, you make up in racial diversity, right? So the problem, of course, is that you can have diversity of race or culture, but you cannot have intellectual diversity in the unanimity, the hive mind of the Democratic Party. And of course, we have so many positions that are at war with one another because we want cultural diversity, but we can't have cultural appropriation. So it's not okay for us to dress up like a Native American, but it is okay for us to eat their food, right? So we have all of these contradictions that are at war with one another. How are we supposed to appreciate one another's culture if we're not allowed to actually participate in it? So there's a reason why, one of the big reasons why Donald Trump is president is because of the rise of the militant social justice warriors, which I think have terrified flyover country and the sort of rational Americans that don't care whether or not there are 25, 35, 75 different kinds of gender. These are not the kinds of issues that impact normal, everyday Americans. And of course, the big problem that we have is that we have things like a dispute over what is private property and what is public property, because the social justice warriors of the left, and believe me, I believe in gay marriage, but why should a Christian be forced to bake a wedding cake for a gay wedding? Because we no longer believe in private property. So until we return to a system where people actually own their own businesses and they own their own lives and their own bodies and can make decisions for themselves for their own culture, whether they be a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew, or a social justice feminist, then we are not going to be able to move forward as a society. We are regressing.
Again, this gets back to a red herring. We're right back to this concept of somehow or another we are forcing people to not be able to do what they want to do, that we are enslaving people and keeping. You know, we have the entire thing about the war on Christmas and how, oh my God, we can't use the word Christmas anymore. And see, those social justice workers are out there keeping us from using the word Christmas. I can sit here and say all day, Merry Christmas to you, Merry Christmas. There's nobody stopping you from doing that. You can say, if you find somebody that you know is of a different faith, you can address them that way. If you find somebody of a Christian faith and you want to say Merry Christmas, you can do that. We have freedom in this country, and to try and sit here and make it sound like we are somehow restricting everybody's ability to say things, or restricting people's ability to dress how they want to for Halloween. If somebody dresses a certain way and they're criticized, fine, they're criticized. We're not stopping them from doing that. Nobody's getting arrested for it.
Tyranny very rarely comes in one fell swoop. It usually
We'll
comes
get there.
in small
We'll get there.
encroachments.
We'll get to tyranny.
In Canada, you can be arrested for not
Mr.
using
Peterson,
a proper
we'll get
pronoun.
to tyranny. In September, Mr. Peterson, you appeared on Alex Jones's InfoWars, a website and network that has repackaged and published thousands of articles from Russia's state-operated news site, RT, and Sputnik, peddled the conspiracy theory that the Sandy Hook shooting was a hoax, and has continued to promulgate a number of conspiracies, such as the theory that, quote, leftist Jews orchestrated the Nazi march on Charlottesville. Does engaging with media figures who lack mainstream credibility negatively affect the legitimacy of conservative claims that the mainstream media is in fact biased? Or is it necessary for the GOP to carve out a space for even those who previously operated on the far fringes of the right wing?
Well, the reason the question is unfair is because you've only seen one slice of the pie, and you haven't seen for the last 7 years how I have consistently debunked conspiracy theories like the 9/11 conspiracy. I've debunked the vaccine conspiracy, and for years I have been calling these people out for being snake oil salesmen that they are. I've been dying for them to invite me on their network so that they can ask me questions about these things and about why Oswald was the lone gunman, but of course they never do. And so the problem there lies in the idea is that you're not allowed to talk to someone even if you disagree with them. I actually appeared on the Kremlin's Russia Today network several times over many years, and I debated the communists. You get no benefit from refusing to talk to someone. No, I'm not going to go sit down and talk with a Nazi on his podcast. But if there are people who you can actually bring to the light, who you can bring on, and there are many people who I have saved from the throes of conspiracy theories and from the Russian conspiracies, and believe me, during the Cold War, many conspiracies existed where the KGB was actively planning conspiracy theories in the United States because they knew how gullible we were. And I have gone out there and fought against that. But the fact that I go and I talk to these people should not be seen as me giving them an excuse. I have been calling them out for years, and the only way I can bring these people to the light is to combat bad ideas with good ideas.
And I couldn't agree more on that. I have to agree with him on that. I don't know what his specific show with Alex Jones was. I don't know what you said. I don't know what questions were asked. But I can tell you this.
Not about Sandy Hook.
It was about the frogs turning gay.
Okay. I can tell you this. He's exactly right. We cannot limit the ability to go on shows like that and talk to people and try and convince them. That's the very root of what is a major problem in this country. The idea from the founding fathers was, we have Austin Peterson sitting here with his ideas of libertarianism, his ideas that he believes strongly in. You have Pat Harris sitting here with his ideas of progressivism he believes strongly in. The concept is we need to be facing off to each other. We need to be fighting over it. We need to be debating it. To ignore each other, if I came in here and said, well, I'm not going to let Austin talk, my God, he's in favor of gay frogs or whatever it was you were talking about, I'm not going to debate him. That's absolutely wrong. We have to be talking about it. We have to be debating it. Everybody, no matter how crazy their ideas are, we have to be debunking them. We have to be discussing them, but we cannot eliminate people we don't agree with.
Mr. Harris, in February of 2016, Matthew Iglesias at Vox penned a piece entitled, "Why I'm More Worried About Marco Rubio Than Donald Trump." This is a sentiment that was echoed throughout the DNC, which, according to leaked emails published by WikiLeaks, had billed Donald Trump as a Pied Piper candidate, one who they thought would be an easier knockout than Senator Rubio. Hindsight, of course, is 20/20 vision. So you tell me, whose vision of America are you more afraid of?
Of Marco Rubio or Donald Trump?
Yes.
Vision-wise, I'm more afraid of probably Marco Rubio, but personality-wise, I'm more afraid of Donald Trump. So I think that's the problem. I think Donald Trump on the campaign trail espoused a much more populist vision, as we talked about. I think he talked about getting rid of corporate welfare. I think he talked about a lot of issues that resonated with working men and women. I think on the campaign trail, a lot of what he said was much better than what Marco Rubio was saying, in my opinion. As it turned out, when he got into office, he became a typical politician and basically did whatever his corporate donors wanted, whatever his people wanted. He turned against everything that he basically campaigned on. So I don't think, from a personality standpoint, I think he changed. So I do think that, and plus just his temperament. I mean, obviously, his temperament's scary, and the fact that he's willing to tweet about things at 3 in the morning is scary. So yeah, personality-wise, I think he's scarier on a different level, though. As far as the conservative level and what they're pushing, I don't agree with that.
Mr. Peterson?
Yeah, I fear and distrust all politicians, which is why I want to limit their power. So the idea is that it doesn't matter who the president of the United States is. It shouldn't matter who they are, because their power should be so extremely limited that it doesn't matter who they are, because they can't screw things up too much. That was the concept of the original understanding of the Constitution. That's why it says, shall write no law, shall not be infringed. It was an understanding that your rights, your liberties are innate. Just brief little story. The freedom of speech in the Constitution gives us an interesting key. There's a key word in the freedom of speech, the most important word, the. Why is the freedom of speech? The is the most important word because the founders recognized that our rights were innate, that they predated the Constitution, that if government, if it is to exist, and I realize anarchists, there are some debates about that, if it is to exist, should be limited to protecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not to run our lives, not to govern us. That way, it doesn't matter who the politician is who is in power because they cannot take away your individual rights.
Okay, so with sexual assault scandals plaguing both parties, charges of whataboutism have been levied towards Republicans and Democrats alike. All this whataboutism masks, however, is a persisting sense of tribalism or unconditional team-like loyalty to cults of personality and identities, rather than triumphs of principle. Centuries ago, our founding fathers referred to this as factionalism. We're deeply fearful of it, but hope that the American people would overcome it. As John Adams famously mapped out in his solution to circumventing tribalism in Federalist Paper 51, quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary." In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. As my final question to the both of you, I must ask, given the escalation of this tribalist effect in recent times, is Adams' vision dead, hopeless, salvageable, or still totally intact? And if it can be revived, what must we do to resurrect it?
I don't have much faith, but I do have faith in the American people. I'll say this, that I make thousands of fundraising calls every month and support for donors and voters. And every once in a while, I'll get a Democrat in there. And the other day, a Democrat answered and said, "I'm sorry, you're a Republican, I can't talk to you." I was like, "Just wait. You know, it kind of breaks my heart when they try and get off the phone. I'm a sweet boy." So when they answered the phone, they didn't want to talk to me because of this, but I sat there and I said, "Listen, sir, I am an American. I could be your representative in Washington, D.C. Don't you want to have the chance to talk to me, to influence me? Let's talk together as human beings. I am sick and tired of party labels. George Washington advocated against the party system. It should not be about parties. It should be about ideas. That's what we should be fighting for." Because I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said that average minds discuss events, good minds, strong minds talk about people, but the greatest minds discuss ideas. We need to return to a constitutional republic of, by, and for the people, where we are no longer fighting for the interests of one narrow party, but for great ideas. As a matter of fact, one of the things that hurt me deeply the most, running as a libertarian last year, was that I had to go to the party elders in a
Final thoughts.
in a primary, rather than a primary. I had to go and I had to sort of kiss the shoes of these party elites, rather than the situation in Missouri right now, where I have an open primary and I don't have to go and kiss the sandals of Mitch McConnell. In an open primary, anyone can vote for me. That's real democracy, where it doesn't matter what the label is after your name. Anyone can vote for you. We need more freedom like this across the United States. I believe in that. I believe in the American people, no matter what the letter is after their name.
Okay.
You started the question by asking about sexual harassment and the fact that obviously it covers both parties. And I think that is a classic example, and I think it's something we have to learn from, because we are talking about a situation that is certainly not limited to Democrats. It's certainly not limited to Republicans. It's not limited to libertarians. It's not limited to any group. What we have to do is we have to realize that those kind of issues are not party related. When I see Democrats stand up and actually support or try and sort of work around what's happened with Democratic, like John Conyers being accused, I look at it and think, you're not anything other than a hypocrite, because you stand up and talk about sexual harassment and how important it is that women not be sexually harassed, and then the first time we find out that a Democrat does it, you're like, well, let's sort of see, maybe not. Let's see what happens. We cannot be taking party labels, forcing every person to adhere to those whatever the party believes, whatever the party says, getting behind it. As Austin just said, we absolutely have to trust the American people. We have to look at it and say, look, we are individuals. We have individual opinions. We are not just party. We're not just going to be mice that follow along willingly to whatever the party says. That's what Austin's doing. That's what I'm doing. I believe very, very strongly the Democratic Party has become a party in many ways of hypocrites. I believe they become a party of the corporate establishment, and I believe very, very strongly we need new leadership and we need new people. I believe that, in fact, we cannot tell people, look, you follow the Democratic ideology or you're out on the street. Just like I believe, by the way, progressives, my own group that I tend to go along with, I don't believe when progressives say, look, you don't support this position, you're not a true progressive, you're out of here, we're not voting for you. That's not how you run a country. It's not how your representatives should be. There is no such thing as purity. We are each individuals, and that's how we should stay.
And on that note, I would like to open it up to questions from the audience, or if we have any from our Facebook Live.
I have a microphone. Okay. Mr. Peterson, Mr. Harris, you've both heard each other today. Explain how, Mr. Harris, explain how your party platform will include more elements of freedom, personal responsibility. Mr. Peterson, explain how your platform will have a social safety net serve the worker better.
Go ahead.
Okay. In terms of how my platform would include more personal responsibility and more direction toward libertarianism, I do think, believe it or not, I think that libertarians are onto a number of issues that I agree with. I do, as I said earlier, I think, for example, that small businesses are overregulated. I think what we found out in this country is, I think we started trying to do a one-size-fits-all with regulation. So, for example, if a corporation with 150 employees we're going to regulate them a certain way, that's just as good for a corporation with 10 or a small business with 10. That's not accurate. They're totally different organisms. We can't be doing that. That's one thing I agree with Republicans on and libertarians on. I also do believe very, very strongly that there needs to be a sense of we are going to let charities, we are going to let churches, we are going to let groups like that, we are going to support them and let them take care of some of the social safety net. We need to promote them. I think one of the problems that Democrats have and progressives have, too often we criticize churches, we criticize groups like that that are religious because maybe we don't necessarily agree with their religion, and we think, well, let's just dismiss them. That's not fair. Churches oftentimes are a large part of the social safety net.
Amen.
In fact, I think that in many cases, I grew up in a very small town in Arkansas, and I can tell you that the church that my father still works at has a thrift store that I was with him on Thanksgiving this last week. And I'll tell you, that thrift store was probably the single biggest store in Clarksville being shopped while I was there because they perform a service that working men and people do, and I think the Republicans are correct about that.
Great question. And if we're talking about a social safety net, we can talk directly, right, and then indirectly. Directly, I think that the problem, of course, is that with Social Security is that they're raiding the bank accounts. And right now we have, I think it's something like a 27% compliance rate with the federal income tax, meaning that only 27% of people who are supposed to pay their taxes are paying their taxes. But if we had a flat tax and a simple flat tax, right, we're almost there, right, almost down to zero. If we had a flat tax, it would make it easier for people to comply, and I think we could patch up the holes in Social Security because they took the money from us in the first place. They should be required to pay it back. But let's talk about another social safety net. Let's talk about the fact that we have a war on drugs, which is creating the highest incarceration rate per capita in the civilized world. If I had to make a compromise, I would rather take the money that we're spending incarcerating people and give them the kinds of services they need so that they won't be addicted to these dangerous drugs. Drugs are bad, okay? So, but the war on drugs is worse. And a good friend of mine died this summer from an overdose. Yes, she should be personally responsible, but she didn't know what was in it. We don't know where it comes from. So if you want to help heal our communities, you have got to stop punishing people for their vices and for their sins. So criminal justice reform would be a big issue towards helping people in their communities.
And I agree 100% with that. And I think one of the interesting things is that criminal justice reform, I actually wrote a book on it. I was a criminal defense attorney and civil rights attorney for 25 years. I wrote a book on criminal justice reform, and it's interesting. I wrote in the last chapter, what people don't realize is, strangely enough, criminal justice reform in the last 10 years didn't begin with progressive Democrats. It began with conservative Republicans.
That's correct.
That's who actually started criminal justice reform. When you combined a number of Republicans who, for example, felt like we were spending too much, the deficit hawks, who were concerned about what we were spending, combined with the religious right, who felt the moral sense of it, it combined to actually start the movement toward criminal justice reform, which I think we are headed toward, hopefully.
Good. Yeah. Elect us.
Nick, can you take that mic?
So one of the issues where this idea of like more regulation versus less regulation came up recently is net neutrality and protecting the free and open internet. And I was just wondering where you guys stand on the issue.
Absolutely 110% in favor of net neutrality. I think one of the big problems we have is we have to recognize this is becoming what will be in the 21st century one of the largest social justice, civil rights issues in this country. And the reason is because I don't think most of the people in California even understand we have a huge percentage of this population in California. We're not talking about in Arkansas. We're not talking about in Wyoming. We're talking about in California that don't even have access to the internet. They don't have the ability, they don't have the broadband width, they don't have the ability to access it in rural counties and areas across. We have to, as a very simple civil rights issue, provide poor neighborhoods in groups around here and in rural areas or poor areas. We have to be able to provide it because it's not fair. The internet, unlike radio, unlike television, the internet is primarily an educational opportunity. We can't say that we're going to allow the students that sit here in USC, we're going to allow you free access to the internet. You can do whatever you want. You can pay, if necessary, you can pay a little additional to get additional services from the internet or faster internet. We can't allow that just because you have money, you are going to get a better internet and you're going to get access to education that the guy up in Shasta County, the kid who's 18 years old up there and is trying to do a paper or is trying to research something, he can't get it. That's absolutely not fair. I think one of the things that's been missing in the net neutrality argument is it is a social justice issue. It is a civil rights issue. Everybody should have access and equality in terms of the internet, and that's the way it ought to be.
As
Period.
Donald Trump would say, wrong on everything. Of course, the number one use for the internet is porn, and no one should be forced to pay for your pornography habits. But net neutrality is
That says
to
more about you
net
than us.
neutrality is to neutrality what the
fired.
Affordable Care Act was to being affordable, and the same way that the Patriot Act was patriotic. The net neutrality, what it really did was it demanded that the internet be treated like a public utility, like water or like electricity. Of course, what you're saying there is that it is a human right. What kind of internet is a human right? Is your mobile phone a human right? Should you be able to purchase packages on a cable line the same way that you purchase packages on your mobile phones? Do you pay for extra data on your mobile phones? Why? Why do you pay for extra data? Because it costs more to deliver higher bandwidth to you when you have technology that is wireless. So when you start treating these cable internet like utilities, you will create a monopoly. If you do not want there to be a monopoly of cable internet, you want to have the kind of deregulatory policies that Missouri, my state, has, so that we could allow for the creation of Google Fiber. And Google Fiber came because we are a low-tax, deregulatory style of state, and so we have more options. If you want more options, then you cannot treat it as a public utility. Everything that you treat as a human right, you will get less of because of the demand for it to be pushed around. Mark Zuckerberg is going to Africa. He's taking drones. He has a financial incentive to go and fly drones and provide free internet to people in Africa because more people will go on Facebook and he will make more money. There is an incentive in the marketplace for more people to be wired. Capitalists will do that. And did you know this actually applies to the roads too, but we'll have that debate later.
And it'll be more access to people who have the money to do it and not the people who can't afford it. You talk about, the Republicans love to talk about, you know, oh, the horrors of Europe and the horrors of these other countries, Venezuela and Argentina. Well, guess what? Venezuela and Argentina, Portugal, these countries actually have they've eliminated net neutrality. And guess what? Go on their sites and see what it costs you. See what it costs you to get basic internet. See what it costs you to get Netflix. See what it costs you
In
to
many
get
cases, it's cheaper.
It's not.
Yes,
It's
it is. Venezuela has food neutrality
Then
too, by the
I
way.
will tell you
Everybody
to
has
do this.
equal access to food.
I will ask you to do
Equal
this.
right to food.
I will ask you to do this then. You want to believe that? Go on the internet site and say, look, go on Portugal.
Yeah.
Go look at their sites and see if it's cheaper. Because I'll tell you what, yeah, it may be cheaper to get a basic package,
Yeah.
but you can't get what you need. And
If
anytime you start adding,
grandma wants to pay $5 and just get email, that's fine. Voice over IP requires quite a bit more programming and power in order to
well,
deliver that
apparently
kind
your
of a service.
grandmother can give you
If she wa-
$10,000, so I
This is
guess
a bunch of-
grandma
no.
can afford it. But most people can't.
These are a
Most
bunch-
people can't afford the
No.
$10,000. Most people can't afford, some of them can't afford more than $10, $15.
What about
and
wait,
you've got to be
cable
able
television.
to allow them access.
For years we complained.
Television is not the same
Wait.
as the internet.
If you guys want to
It
take one
is.
more
It's
question,
delivered over
we have
the
to
same
move
lines in
on.
many respects.
It is not an educational tool
Consumers
like the
complained
internet.
that they weren't able to get just Fox Television. They weren't able to buy piecemeal all of the different cable channels.
Another red
Now we're
herring.
complaining about the opposite. Now we're saying, no, you cannot get piecemeal internet. How dare you say you would only pay $5 a month? It's illegal to create competition.
It is.
That's what you're doing with net
absolutely a red
neutrality. It
herring
needs to be
because
abolished.
television and cable television is not the same as the internet. You well know the fact that every single one of you sitting in this room access the internet for educational purposes. Most of you are on television so you can watch the latest episode of whatever's the Game of Thrones or whatever. That's why you're on television, not for educational purposes.
Let's move on
That's
to
not what the internet is.
let's
It's
move
an
on to-
educational tool.
It's a debate.
Thank you.
Let's move on to a Facebook Live question.
Timothy Fiedler asks, if you're both on the outside, why not run as an unaffiliated candidate?
Great question. I think the question was, since we're both sort of outsiders, why don't we run as independent candidates? That's a great question. It really is.
Well, you're also the last one, so
Oh,
bear that
okay.
in mind.
I think that, truthfully, for me, on a personal level, I have made the decision to run as a Democrat, basically because I grew up as a Democrat. I grew up in a Democratic family. My mother basically looked at in the 50s and 60s and 70s, she preached to me that the order of the things they went, it was a Democratic Party, God, family. It was just a very strong Democratic Party household. I think I grew up with those traditions and the things the Democrat represented, the working man, they represented labor. That's who they were. So I think it's very hard for me on a personal level to say that I have to pull away from the Democratic Party to run as an independent, but I will tell you this, and this is why I think it's a great question. There are nights that I wake up and say, it's very hard to stay. It's very hard to run as a Democrat. When I see, for example, things like going and talking to Wall Street for $600,000, when I see the Democratic Party basically turn around and support John Conyers or say, well, we need to give him due process over sexual harassers, all of a sudden, just him. When I see the Democratic Party continue to do what I told you Dianne Feinstein was doing, where she went to Beverly Hills, the first thing out, and had a fundraiser at a billionaire's house, when I see their failure to actually go talk to people, then yeah, sometimes I wonder, and I'll admit that.
You know, Republicans will often run like libertarians, but then when they're elected, they govern like Democrats. I mean, I'm a rebel, you know, and I'll just say, been there, tried that. I spent 2 months earlier this year on the phones calling over 4,000 people, and I asked them all 2 questions. I said, should I run? 100% said yes. When I asked what party I should run for, 98% or more said run as a Republican. Well, they believe that my pro-life, pro-liberty, and pro-constitution standpoints are what the Republican Party claims to stand for, so maybe I would be a much better model for the future of the Republican Party. Maybe I can make a difference. But when your supporters who give their $50 in the top of their change jar, I mean, I have single moms, active duty military service members, and they've given me over $250,000, $50 at a time, when they tell me, Austin, please run as a Republican, and I will come to Missouri and I will vote for, I will campaign for you, or I will go knock on doors for you, or I will give you my last $75. People are giving everything they have to this campaign. I have to listen to my grassroots supporters. But I will say this, when one of my grassroots supporters the other day said that they would cut off funds from me if I didn't support net neutrality, I said no. So you should have integrity in your politicians, even to be able to stand up to your own donors. And I will stand for what I believe in no matter who is funding my campaign, because I believe in something. I'm not campaigning because I want to take something from someone. I'm campaigning because I want to give power back to the people. And that's why I'm running as a Republican, so that I can take power and give it back to the people.
Okay, I'd like to bring the board up here as a final thank you. to thank you again to the Harris campaign and to the Peterson campaign and to everyone in the audience for coming here and engaging in a free expression of ideas. So this is our board. Thank you.
Pat,
Pleasure.
well done.
Absolutely.
Very good,
Same
and
to you.
best
A lot
of luck
fun.
to you on your campaign.
Thank you. The same to you.
Yep.
If your grandma wants to write me that
There's
10,000.
also pizza in the back if there's any left.
Pat Harris for Senate.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep.
It was fun.
That was fun.
We agree on a lot of things.
Yeah.
It's